Okay, great. Well, thanks everybody. I'm Kent Singer. I'm the Executive Director of the Colorado Rural Electic Association. So I'm the head of a trade association. I'm not the head of a utility like Brian is. Watching Brian's presentation though, I was interested in the fact that he's the head of a water utility, and I was kind of hoping that as the supplier to New Belgium Brewing, maybe he would bring a couple of cases of fat tire, but I don't see it here, so maybe we'll get that later. But anyway, like I said, we have something in common in that we're part of the public power sector of electric utilities. So really, in Colorado and across the country, there's basically three sectors. There's investor-owned utilities like Xcel or Black Hills Energy in Colorado, and then there's public power. Public power is comprised of really municipal utilities like Fort Collins or Colorado Springs. There's like 28 or so municipal utilities in Colorado. And then the electric co-ops are really the third sector out there. And we've all got kind of different histories as how we came to be. For co-ops weren't created until the late 1930s. Roosevelt, FDR, signed an executive order in 1935 creating the Rural Electrification Administration as one of the New Deal programs during the Depression in the 30s. And then Congress in 1936 adopted legislation which then implemented that act. So co-ops have only been around since the 1930s. And you heard Brian talk about the fact that Fort Collins Utilities has been around since the 1880s or so, which just shows you had a period of 40 or 50 years where essentially urban areas in the United States were electrified and rural areas still were not. For a long time, rural areas across the country did not have electricity and wouldn't have had it for a lot longer had not FDR created the REA program, which, like I said, came about in the 30s. So this is, I'll just do a kind of a co-op 101 here. I'm glad to answer any questions later that you might have about it. But this is the electric co-op service territory in Colorado. So there are 22 electric distribution cooperatives, and they're all depicted here in the color on this map. Anything that's got a color is an electric distribution co-op service territory. And where there's not electric co-ops, and we serve about 73 or 4% of the land mass of Colorado, but only about 25% of the actual consumers. So we serve a lot of territory, don't have a lot of consumers typically. Now you can see, of course, along the I-25 corridor where their co-ops were created, certainly there are co-ops now serving some pretty heavily suburban and essentially urban territory. Intermountain Rural Electric Association is an example, United Power, Poudre Valley, which had a lot of its, had some of its facilities affected by the High Park fire we were talking about. So some of those utilities along I-25 have some more dense territory, but the real key characteristic of electric co-ops compared to the other two kinds of utilities is their lack of density in terms of consumers per mile of line. Nationally, there are about 900 electric co-ops nationally, and we serve on average about 7 consumers per mile of line. The investor-owns are up in the 30, 35 consumers per mile of line, and I think Brian's utilities are in the 40 or 45 consumers per mile of line. So the point is it's expensive to serve these territories. We've got a lot of facilities, a lot of distribution lines, substations, generation plant, transmission, all the stuff that is required to serve electricity consumers, but a whole lot fewer people to recover those costs from. So that's a dynamic we have to deal with. So we've got the 22 co-ops. They're all separate utilities, all distinct. They're all nonprofit utilities. They're member-owned. So each of them, if you're in any of these areas, you're served. Is anybody in here an electric co-op consumer, member-owner? 1, 2, or 3. Okay. So you guys who are understand this well. You get your bill from the co-op. You're a member-owner, meaning you actually have a capital interest in the co-op. As you pay your bill, the co-op keeps track of your patronage, how much you spend each month, and over time actually refunds patronage capital back to its members, depending on its financial circumstances. And usually it's a delay. Co-ops now are paying back capital credits that were accrued in the early 90s. It depends on the co-op situation, but you actually own the co-op. If it were ever dissolved, the value, the assets would be divided among all the members. So again, of all these co-ops, they're distribution co-ops. They don't produce power on their own. They buy power and then they distribute it. Most of these co-ops get their power from a company called Tri-State Generation and Transmission Association, which is also a member of my trade association, CREA. 18 of these co-ops get their power from Tri-State. The other 4 have a wholesale requirements contract with Xcel. So Grand Valley on the western slope, and Yampa Valley, and Holy Cross, and Intermountain, those 4 are all wholesale requirements customers of Xcel Energy. So they've got contracts with Xcel. The other 18 have contracts with Tri-State. And the Tri-State contract is an important thing. It really serves as the collateral for government loans. Tri-State and these distribution co-ops can borrow money from the government, from the Rural Utility Service, at low rates. Some of those co-ops have bought out of their federal loans and no longer owe money to the government. Most of them still do have RUS loans. There are other lenders. There's a company called CoBank that's headquartered here in Colorado. Another company called CFC, which is a co-op, which also loans money to co-ops. So a lot of them still have loans outstanding from the government. And there still are yearly appropriations in the USDA budget for co-ops. So again, you've got all these guys. They're very different. You know, like I said, Southeast Colorado has about 1.8 consumers per mile of line. Very sparse service territory. United Power, well, actually Holy Cross here in the Roaring Fork Valley, and it serves Vail and Aspen, is a very dense co-op. It's got 14 or 15 consumers per mile of line. But like I said, they've got, you know, and you guys know Colorado very well, and kind of know the geopolitical differences among all these parts of the state. Some of these co-ops, those 4 particularly on the eastern tier, are heavy irrigating co-ops. In other words, a lot of their electricity is sold to run pumps to irrigate crops. Their financial situation each year will be determined based on the hydrology, whether they got any rain. You know, the more rain you get in eastern Colorado, the less power they sell. So it's a worse year for them financially. But of course, that's, you know, we're not in it for the money, so they're all serving their rural constituents and love it when it rains. Otherwise, they've got to pump out of those aquifers. And you've got mountain co-ops. Colorado is very unique in terms of the co-op territory nationwide. There are very few states that have this kind of diversity, both geographically, culturally, politically. A lot of the co-op territory nationally is really more homogenous, but Colorado is very diverse. So that's just what the co-op map looks like. And like I said, I can answer any questions you might have about later. What I wanted to do, secondly, was just talk about, you know, the focus of this evening's presentations is on sustainability. And there has really been a shift, I think, in the co-op mindset when it comes to sustainability. And that's because of co-ops are, you know, their governance is from their member owners. All of their boards of directors are comprised of members of the co-op. So, you know, if you think your co-op ought to be greener or take on different policies, you can go to your board of directors, you can go to your annual meeting and talk to the manager and get input on that. In western Nebraska, in Wyoming, in Colorado, and New Mexico, so Tri-State, right? It had to do with a merger with New Mexico co-ops about 10 years ago, but they just didn't want to change the name because everyone was used to it. But they energized this about 2 years ago. This is actually on Ted Turner's property. The Southern company actually owns this solar array, but Tri-State has made it possible by having a 20-year power purchase agreement. And so Tri-State's bringing some of these on. Now, granted, it's bringing some of these things on because of the Renewable Portfolio Standard laws in Colorado and New Mexico. So Colorado's got an RPS of 10% for the co-ops by 2020. New Mexico's got a 10% RPS, meaning, you know, their distribution co-op members have to provide 10% of their power from renewables by 2020. So to meet that, all of that obligation's on the end-use distribution co-op. Tri-State has said, well, you know, they're our customers, so we've got to provide their power supply in a way which will allow them to meet that requirement. So that's on about a 300-acre tract in northern New Mexico. And this actually, Tri-State's now got a couple of years' experience running this thing, and I think they had projected it would be about a 22 or 23% capacity factor, meaning, you know, if you look at the number of hours in a year, it would run about 22 or 23% of the time. I think it's a little better than that. It's been like 25 or 26% capacity factor. So I think they've been generally pleased with that, the output of that. Tri-State's got 2 wind farms now up and running. This one's on the eastern plains of Colorado. The Kit Carson project is 51 megawatts. That was energized a couple of years ago. This Colorado Highlands project is 67 megawatts. This just came online about 3 or 4 months ago. It was dedicated. The guy there is the manager of Highlands Electric Association, the distribution co-op where this wind farm is located. And So again, that's a total of about 120 or so megawatts of capacity of wind, which when you compare it to XL's wind portfolio, that's a small amount. I mean, XL's got about 2,000 megawatts of wind in Colorado, but they're a much bigger utility, so it makes sense that they would have that. And though, the other point I want to make though is they've got a better ability to integrate wind into their system. They've got more natural gas-fired generators that are quick start, quick stop, and can integrate more of these intermittent resources. And Tri-State's got fewer of those facilities for a lot of complicated reasons. I mean, you can go back to the 1978 Fuel Use Act, but Tri-State has got a lot of coal-fired power. It's gaining more gas in its portfolio, and the more natural gas-fired plants it gains, it will have more capacity to integrate more wind. So that's the second wind farm Tri-State's got. It's also got about 100 megawatt RFP out on the street today to do another 100 megawatts of wind. And I'll just show you a few of the individual co-op projects. And these are small, much smaller than the two I just showed you, but it just is kind of an example of what co-ops are doing in this whole space. And it's really been a real sea change in the last 3 or 4 years in terms of sort of co-op acceptance of these projects and their desire of their members to put them online. So United Power up in Brighton, actually several years ago, started its first community solar farm. Holy Cross Electric, that's one of the bigger, they've got a couple of solar farms. They've got one in the Roaring Fork Valley that's smaller than that. That's almost a megawatt. That came online a year or so ago. That's not fully subscribed yet, but Holy Cross first started this project. It really was the first co-op that I think the first co-op in the country to create this community solar farm concept, where they've got a third party, an entity called the Clean Energy Collective, some of you may be familiar with, who actually owns and operates the facility. Holy Cross just agrees to do the accounting, basically. If they have members of their co-op who want to lease a panel, they can do that, and Holy Cross will then credit them against their bill for the energy produced from those panels. So there are now, I think, 7 distribution co-ops who have community solar farms, and there are several more considering them. Hydro has always been a big part of the energy mix for Colorado co-ops. Tri-State gets about, it depends on the year, the hydrology, Tri-State gets anywhere from 15 to 18% of its overall power supply from the big federal dams. The Colorado River Storage Project and the big dams that have been Bureau of Reclamation projects that have been there for decades. Of course, those projects don't count toward the renewable portfolio standard in Colorado. That law was passed, and the ballot initiative was passed in 2004. It excluded large hydro as an eligible resource. I think it was intended to generate more development of wind and solar, and so they wanted to exclude the large hydro. But this is a smaller hydro project that Poudre Valley took on, and I think also finished that one last year. DMEA, Delta Montrose, there's this, what's called the South Canal, a canal that's been in place for, gosh, I think almost 100 years, but no one ever put a turbine on it. And DMEA's worked for several years to get this project up and running, and I think that's going to be a good resource. Although, again, it's not going to run year-round. It's essentially a spring runoff sort of project, so they'll get power out of it for really just a few months. There are a couple of these kinds of projects in co-op territory where you've got co-ops. In this case, it's La Plata. Highland Electric's also got one where you take these stations that are moving natural gas, and they have heat coming off of them, and you take the heat and use it in a turbine to create electricity. That's a pretty large facility where you're kind of making use of that natural gas waste heat. United Power's got another landfill gas energy project that it energized either last year or the year before. This Holy Cross project came online last year, and again, it's a coal mine where they're taking the methane off the coal mine and running it through a generator and creating electricity. That project just came online, and this is one where there's sort of an intersection between what happens on the ground and at the legislature. Right now, coal mine methane is not included as one of the categories of renewables. There was a bill last year to try to include it that we supported, because I think there are a few more projects out there like this that might get done if the electricity were considered to be renewable, so you could get renewable energy credits for it. This one was economic anyway because you had enough people supporting it. In this case, the Aspen Ski Company actually subsidized this project. I think that's kind of unique. I'm not sure how many more of those that they would do. But it's just kind of an interesting thing where you had a piece of legislation where, you know, the methane is far more potent as a greenhouse gas than CO2. And so really this one project kind of swamps all of the other renewables in terms of its CO2 or greenhouse gas benefits. But yet we had a hard time convincing the legislature that should be included. And you had all kinds of politics going back and forth. But I think Senator Schwartz is going to introduce another bill on this year, and we'll see if it gets passed. And then finally, I just want to talk about this. This is a project that we started at CREA. All of the co-ops have done energy efficiency for a long time. Again, we're not for-profit entities, and we're not interested in selling more kilowatt hours each year just for the sake of doing it. So all the co-ops have had energy efficiency projects for a long time. Their power supplier, Tri-State, has provided funds for weatherization and irrigation motor switch-outs, all kinds of projects like that. But we're trying to increase that even more and see if we can't bring together a lot of different groups. I was at a meeting this morning with, I think it's the Center for Energy and Agriculture from CSU, and I think there are some monies in the Colorado Department of Agriculture, potentially in the Colorado Energy Office, and the USDA has some money potentially to do more energy efficiency projects, and we're trying to see if we can leverage some of those things and do more of that in co-op territory and identify some state facilities that might benefit from some energy retrofits. And then finally, just my trade association, again, I don't run a utility, I run this trade association, and one of our primary functions is the lobby at the legislature, both in Colorado and to some extent in DC, although our national group does most of that. But we're down at the Colorado legislature every day. We've got a couple lobbyists, and we're always watching energy bills. And I think that we always have to find this balance. I mean, Brian talked about sustainability, and from our perspective, certainly the environmental sustainability is important, but we're also concerned about the economic sustainability, the sustainability of rural Colorado, which is tenuous in a lot of places in the state where people are just leaving. You've got communities that are kind of on their last breath. And energy prices to them are important, and they're important to farmers and ranchers. And so we've got to balance doing the right thing environmentally with the cost of those things. And so sometimes we're not always in favor of bills that some of you might be, because you're trying to find the right balance on cost. But that's all I've got, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.